Welcome back, everybody, and we're now heading into our next session. And first of all, I'd just like to welcome, you'll see at the top table, Johanna Ivers, and I'll introduce Johanna at the next presentation. But firstly, just to welcome across, Paul is here. Yeah, Paul Griffiths is here. Paul is, first of all, thanks to Paul for travelling from his home and his base and his work base in Lisbon, which is the headquarters of the EU Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction. And I think that you'll find this particular piece very, very informative in terms of giving us a wider international perspective. So over to Paul, who has 15 minutes. Thank you, Paul.
Good morning. Thanks, Paul. I've been strictly told I've got to keep to time. I'll do my best. Well, good morning, everyone. I work for the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction. And we exist to provide information to support policy and actions to address drug issues at the European level. And I think the first point I want to make, we're policy neutral. We don't try and tell member states what to do. And we work both in their health and security, on both health and security issues. So we look at things related to problems caused by drug use, but also problems caused by some of the criminality related to the drug market, and increasingly broader security concerns. And what do I want to talk about this morning? Well, I want to talk a little bit about how the work of my agency has changed over the last 25 years and so since we've been working. I want to make some personal observations. These are not an EU position, it's my personal views about why this has happened, and I hope these are helpful for your deliberations as you go forward in this process. And really what I want to do is highlight the complexity in this area and why there's no simple solutions or magic bullets, and if there were, we would have found them, trust me. And the background to this, I want to say, and I really want to emphasize how important scientific evidence is. It's really important to understanding how we should respond to drug problems. But in a complex area like this, it's never going to be sufficient on its own. And that's why to determine the overall policy framework. And I'll say a little bit about that and why I think exercises like this are so really crucially important and valuable. And I've only got really one point, and it's a very simple point, and that's the drug issue has always been a very complicated one. But it's got even more complicated over time, and I think this is likely to continue as we go forward. And reflecting this, when we try and provide information to inform policy deliberations, the needs have evolved considerably. And the result of all of this is, at the time I've worked in the monitoring centre, the focus of our work has got ever wider, and the policy areas relevant to our work have become ever broader. And we're dealing with things today that I've never thought we were dealing with 20 years ago or so, or even 10 years ago. And you can see this in the conclusions we made to last year's EDR. The EDR is a sort of overview, general report we do on the drug situation in Europe. And it started with 3 central messages. Today, drug-related issues appear almost everywhere. You're familiar with things like overdose and drug treatment, but also it affects things like homelessness, affects things like mental health problems, but also broader things like even climate change and governance in low and middle income countries, all infected by what we're seeing in the drugs area. And also we're seeing a much more broader problem. Almost anything today with a psychoactive potential can potentially be used as a drug. And the result of this is, I think, that drug use can affect everyone, either directly or indirectly, and often in ways that I think are a little bit hidden. And I think that's one of the things that you'll discover as you go through in this journey. But it was all a lot simpler when I started, certainly 25 years or so ago in the monitoring centre working with the UN. Our real focus then was heroin use and drug injecting, and that was after the 70s and 80s when a big epidemic of opiate use hit Europe. Policymakers didn't really know how to respond to that, and there was a lot of focus around what the main issues we were looking at, things like HIV risk behaviour related to injecting, and then the associated criminality that was associated with addictive behaviours. And very much the lens that we looked at that was through plant-based drugs that were produced outside the EU and they were transshipped into the EU and consumed in Europe. And we did look at other drugs a little bit, but mainly in terms of estimates of drug use, background prevalence figures from surveys and general and school populations. Over time, however, life has become much, much more complicated. We saw in the 18s the emergence of a synthetic drug, ecstasy, suddenly appeared. Again, it was a different group. It wasn't a marginalised group of consumers. It really hit policymakers a little bit by surprise. Later we saw then the appearance in the 90s of the new psychoactive substances, the NPS as they're called, drugs that were chemically different to those controlled on the international drug conventions and marketed to avoid those sorts of controls, often sold to young users as being safe and legal products and changed over time. The work we're doing now, when I'm working on this year's report at the moment, I'll only be speaking to you tomorrow, and we're looking at increasing our focus on things like crack, and, cocaine use, and crack cocaine use became a major issue, major drug in Europe now. Methamphetamine, I think, is going to be something we really have to worry about for the future. But we're also looking at drugs like ketamine that are important in some country, and the caffeinones, and many of these things we wouldn't have been discussing 10 years or so ago. And increasingly also we're having to deal with a very complicated and difficult area of misused medicines, fake medicines, uncontrolled medicinal products, some of these bought online from outside Europe, not licensed for use in the UK, but in the EU, but appearing on the drug market and used alongside more traditional drugs of use. And we're also seeing much greater regulatory complexity. We saw that with the NPS coming in, really blindsided us in terms of the regulatory approaches we take, but also now we see with cannabis, we see a lot of products derived from the cannabis plant as legal products in the European market. We're seeing some countries looking at how they control cannabis in different ways. And we're also seeing now interest in how psychedelics can be used for therapeutic purposes, both in a regulated form and outside of regulatory frameworks. And all this has been happening at a time we've seen profound evolution in the drug market. So we've seen the drug market become much more globally connected. We've seen it's much more digitally enabled. And increasingly we're seeing production within the EU, both for the EU market and for export elsewhere. And there was an example, I don't know if you saw it in the papers yesterday, about a large secondary cocaine processing lab detected in Spain. And along the Spanish nationals, you had Colombian and Mexican nationals working there. That was in the papers yesterday. And just to give you a few recent examples of some of the complexity this means for us and some of the things we've been dealing in our work, we're still seeing about 51 week, one new psychoactive substance appearing on the European market, and that adds to the 600 or so we're already monitoring. These are Xanax, benzodiazepine bars. They're not actually available in this form in Europe usually, but these are fake bars, and they contain fentanyl, a highly potent synthetic opioid that's responsible for a public health emergency in North America. About a couple of months ago, we released a report on nitrous oxide, laughing gas. It has many industrial and legitimate uses, but it's also being used now for young people for getting high. And this is an interesting one. This is a little ahead on the curve on this. We released a report on this drug on Monday. It was first reported to us at the end of last year. It's the first semi-synthetic cannabinoid HAC report in the EU. It can be made from cannabidiol, that's CBD. You see a lot of that advertised now in the commercial market. Extracted from low THC cannabis or hemp, and there's a lot of that around now. And it's available in vapes, edibles, and hemp sprayed with HHC, which looks like and smells like genuine herbal cannabis. And there's a picture there from a vending machine that's taken a couple of weeks ago in Germany, where you can buy HHC vapes in a vending machine, and also some HHC-laced sweets that are being produced in the Netherlands. And against all this complexity in terms of the drugs we're dealing with, we're also seeing much greater complexity in terms of patterns of use. So polydrug use, that's using more than one substance together, has always been really important in terms of drug use. Most drug users often use multiple substances, including alcohol. But it's become more important now, and I think it can be a driver of many of the problems we face, especially in respect to toxicity. It increases risk through drug interaction effects. That's when two drugs are used together, they have different implications and different risks. And because people often may be knowingly or increasingly unknowingly consuming mixtures of substances. And there's an example on this slide in the middle picture, which is some cannabis that was being laced with synthetic cannabinoids, some of which are very, very toxic, but the people buying it thought they were buying just normal herbal cannabis. And just to give you a very quick example of what the implications of this and why it's often important to consider, this is some real data, toxicological data of fatal heroin overdose cases. And what you see is rarely in this do we find heroin isolation. If you look at that little red circle in the bottom, that was only the cases where only heroin was found. Most of those deaths involved multiple substances increasing. You see there psychoactive medicines were involved. That's the green bars. So we can't think about drug use in isolation. That's my point. And the other thing that's happened over the last decade or so is that synthetic drugs have become much more important and create new challenges for drug control and for public health. They can be extremely potent, increasing the risk to health, They can be produced near to consumer markets, reducing the risk of detection, and manufactured from a wide variety of hard-to-control precursor chemicals. And very small volumes can represent large number of potential street doses, potentially increasing health risks and making interdiction by law enforcement more challenging. And just to give you an example of this is a very much a back-of-the-envelope calculation, but I think it's useful as an illustrative example, how much pure drugs is required to make 10,000 street doses. In the past, we needed to move large containers of plant-based drugs from outside Europe into Europe. These days, you can put hundreds of thousands of potential street doses in an envelope and put it in the parcel post. So all this complexity I'm talking about is happening during a period of also rapid global change. And the world has changed and is changing rapidly in ways that have profound implications for all areas of our modern life, including the drugs area. And many of the drivers that are impacting on drug use and drug problems are external and common to other policy areas. And at the EU level, part of the way we've dealt with that is to increase the resilience and preparedness of foresight exercise. That's where we look at things that might happen, not will happen, but could happen in the future. And how do we make our policies more resilient to them is now regarded as a key element in the policy formation process. So you don't need to just think about addressing the problems of the past or today. It's how do we make sure our policies are resilient to the problems of the future. And just to give you an example of this that show that many of the important global drives for change lie outside the drugs policy area but may impact profoundly on it. This is an exercise we did with policymakers and experts in Europe looking at the things that are likely to impact on drug use over the next 10 years. And it was things like climate change and increasing demographic imbalances that were going to be important, but they're not things we normally think about, but we need to. And really, it's this hyperconnectivity, it's globalization, digitalization has transformed the drug market, certainly over the last years. The reason we have such high availability of drugs today is that trafficking gangs have been very adept at using the vast increase in intermodal container transport to smuggle large volumes of drugs in a way that was just impossible in the past. And at the same time, we see the digitally enabling of the drug market. So seeing people being able to buy drugs online, and on darknet, but also increasingly on the open net or through social media applications. And I'm sorry if up to now it's all sound a bit pessimistic, and I didn't want to do that because I think there's still quite a lot of hope here. Whilst national policy perspectives differ in Europe, there's far more consensus than there used to be. So there's a lot more agreement in what we should be doing than when I started in the field, where you really did have very polarised perspectives. And I think that's a part of your journey, I suspect, will be starting at different perspectives but coming together in your journey. There's much general thought for a balanced approach that addresses both supply and demand holistically and recognises the role that prevention, treatment, harm reduction can play. And within the European context, we always frame that in respect for human rights. We have much better evidence of what can work and better understanding of things that don't. And overall, by global comparison, the situation in Europe, and we have many problems, but it still looks in many ways more positive than it does in other parts of the world. And just in terms of think about overdose deaths, we probably see about 7,000 of those annually in the EU, probably 10 times that, a similar population in North America, over 10 times that many. So we do have policies that do have traction. They're not perfect, but they're not totally imperfect either. And we do know, and I think we increasingly have evidence, that policy approaches can make a difference in respect to both the societal costs that are associated with drug consumption, and that difference can be both positively and negative. And again, I think just showing the importance of the deliberations you're going to be having over the coming weeks. And finally, just to make some concluding observation, I think we all need to recognise that all policy options tend to bring with them both costs and benefits. And what good evidence does, and it's really useful in understanding what these are likely to be, but it tends to be framed within a specific context and linked to a specific set of outcomes, often things that we can measure. But at the broader policy level, there might be other outcomes that are also important. There's also, in such a complex area, there's always going to be considerable uncertainty. And we cannot assume that what works with one group or in one context or in one country will necessarily work exactly in the same way elsewhere. And also, as I've made the point already, as our problems we face change rapidly, we need to ensure that our policies are appropriate to not just the problems we're facing today, but the problems we're likely to face in the future. So finally, drug problems don't exist in a vacuum, but interact with, complicate and exacerbate problems in other policy areas. Some people have called this a wicked problem. It's where there's incomplete or complete knowledge. Number of people and opinions are numerous. And the problems interconnect with other problems in other policy areas. And my last remark is that complex, multi-sectoral policy issues are likely to require complex, multi-sectoral approaches. Thank you very much, and I wish you good luck on your journey.